Namaskar viewers, hello and welcome to Sansad TV. I'm Tina Jha, you're watching Perspective. As the United Nations marks its 80th year, questions about its relevance and effectiveness have never been more pressing. At a high-level meeting of like-minded Global South nations on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar called for greater solidarity among developing countries to push collectively for reforms to the United Nations and other global institutions. Citing a series of global shocks from the pandemic to conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza to climate change and trade uncertainties, Dr. Jaishankar underlined the urgency of strengthening multilateralism while lamenting the disappointing prospects currently facing the Global South. India has long been a leading advocate for more representative international order, backing an expanded UN Security Council alongside Germany, Japan and Brazil, as well as broad segments of the Global South. UN Secretary-General António Guterres has also voiced support for reforms to better reflect the realities of 2025 and beyond. Today, we take a closer look at the United Nations at 80, its relevance in tackling contemporary challenges, its limitations and the roadblocks to meaningful reform. Joining us for a discussion are two distinguished guests. I'm delighted to welcome on the program today Ambassador Sanjay Bhattacharya, former diplomat. Ambassador, always a pleasure to have you with us on Sansad TV. And I'm also pleased to welcome Dr. Sheetal Sharma, Professor, Center for European Studies, JNU. Dr. Sharma, thank you for your time. Welcome to the program. But before we begin the discussion, let me very briefly, viewers, give you an overview of the history and structure of the United Nations. So you would know the United Nations was founded in 1945 with just 51 members. Currently, it is made up of 193 member states. Its work is guided by the purposes and principles contained in its founding charter. All UN member states are members of the General Assembly. States are admitted to membership by a decision of the General Assembly upon the recommendation of the Security Council. Now coming to the main bodies of the United Nations. So the General Assembly is the main deliberative, policy-making and representative organ of the UN. All 193 member states of the UN are represented in the General Assembly, making it the only UN body with universal representation. But the Security Council has primary responsibility under the UN Charter for the maintenance of international peace and security. So it has only 15 members, 5 permanent and 10 non-permanent members. Each member has one vote under the Charter. All member states are obligated to comply with Council decisions. The Security Council takes the lead in determining the existence of a threat to the peace or act of aggression. It calls upon the parties to a dispute to settle it by peaceful means and recommends methods of adjustment or terms of settlement. In some cases, the Security Council also can resort to imposing sanctions and even authorize the use of force to maintain or restore international peace and security. The other bodies of the UN are the Economic and Social Council, the Trusteeship Council, the International Court of Justice and the UN Secretariat. So we'll try and understand how a global organization which was established way back in 1945 in a completely different geopolitical context is now marking 80 years of its establishment, but it has not evolved to reflect the 21st century realities, despite there being consistent calls from countries like India to make it transform, to look into the contemporary problems and also work on effective solutions, something which is its objective. So, Ambassador, coming to you for your opening remark, first on what Dr. Jaishankar said at one of the events on the sidelines of the UNGA. He has called for greater solidarity among the Global South to push for UN reforms. Now, this is quite timely given that he is about to make a statement, make a speech at the UN General Assembly. And on the sidelines, when the United Nations is marking 80 years of its foundation, Dr. Jaishankar has this statement to say. So, what according to you, in your view, why in fact, in your view, has such solidarity become all the more urgent now?
Well, in some ways, the situation that we see today on the 80th anniversary of the United Nations bears certain similarities with the situation when it was created in 1945. Right. The first is that we see the prevalence of conflict and death and devastation in different parts of the world. Of course, it's not of the same scale as it was at the time of the World War, but the intensity continues to be very high. The second is that economic development remains a crying call of most countries, particularly the developing global south. And there is a need that we bring about institutions that can respond effectively to their demands and aspirations. And so, in that particular context, we have a situation where a multilateral organization like the UN, which had actually performed a very laudable role in both development as well as in peacekeeping over several decades, seems to have lost its particular momentum. And today seems to be one which is not clearly representative of the aspirations of the developing world. Now, the Global South, as we call it, is a group of nations that are not just developing, but many of them are what we call emerging markets in developing countries, or EMDCs. And EMDCs, in a sense, have much more capability and ability and desire to bring about the change in global governance than most others can. Unfortunately, the Charter of the United Nations has a certain restriction which kind of puts the onus on the permanent five in terms of most of the significant changes that are necessary. And so what we've seen is over a period of time that a lot of the changes that are necessary, that are called for by the developing countries, led by India in many cases, have not really borne fruit because certain members of the P5 have been obstructionist in the path of reform. But I must say that this is not something that has dissuaded the Global South from bringing about its own coalitions. And so what the Global South has done through the various decades, and even more today, is to bring about alternate institutions that meet some of their aspirations while they hope that the multilateral system can still be fixed.
So how will that solidarity actually help in calling for UN reforms? Will it be effective is something that we will discuss with Dr. Sharma. But the reason, Professor, why I listed out the UN structure and why it has not reformed even in 80 years is that we see that the UNGA has, of course, expanded in the last 80 years. In 1945, there were just 51 members. Today, there are 193 members. But the Security Council, which is the most important body, which is in a way the decision-making body, and which has the responsibility of maintaining peace and security, has not expanded at all. The P5, of course, we know one country does not want the expansion, despite India, along with countries like Germany, Japan, Brazil, advocating for an expanded Security Council. Tell us that, to our viewers, talk to us about the key factors, the key reasons behind the roadblocks, the obstacles that are in a way stopping this expansion, except of course that veto. But are there other geopolitical factors that something that we are missing in conversations?
Tina, very interestingly, if we look at the historical evolution of the United Nations, it was a kind of group that was constituted by the elite, the victors of the war. But at the same time, there was one country that was representing the have-not world, China particularly, I would talk about. Now, when I look at the total composition and the structure which you mentioned, which is now United Nations General Assembly, UNGA, which represents almost all the countries on the earth except for one or two, which are very small in size and scale. But nevertheless, the one vote that every country has in the General Assembly is somehow trying to give them a representation at a multilateral organization which represents the entire globe. Now, what about the expansion and the representation? Let us bring the statement that the Foreign Affairs Minister has actually put forward in order to talk about, India's greater representativeness or greater role in United Nations. Now, the structure itself, as we are talking about the Security Council, which has 5 permanent members and the 10 non-permanent members, which happens on a basis of rotation every 2 years. Now, what is very interesting in the permanent 5, P5, what you see are the 3 Western powers, which is called as Western Europe, and the other group, which is United States of America, UK, France, and US. And then one is Russia, which again is contested. Do you consider this as a Eurasian power, a European power, or East European power, or an Asian power? And then one from China, which is one from Asia, which is China. What is missing in the entire configuration is the Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific region, which constitutes, I would say, 55% of the world population and almost 44% of the revenue goes, the funding of the United Nations comes from these countries. Now, these countries hold important strategic powers such as Japan, South Korea, and India here, and Australia as well. So, how can you imagine an organization which does not represent certain important players in the global politics, plus two continents altogether missing,
Right.
Asia and Latin America?
The point that Professor was making, that continents and populations are not just being not represented, but also some of them are underrepresented. The UN's handling of contemporary crises has also brought to fore its relevance in the current geopolitical context. How, according to you, has the United Nations handling of particularly the recent conflicts, for example, the Russia-Ukraine war and what's happening in Gaza? There are several other regional conflicts also happening simultaneously. How have these exposed the limitations of the United Nations and perhaps strengthened the case for India and the other countries which are advocating for change at the highest level?
In some ways, the United Nations came out of the experience of the League of Nations, which was, set up to bring about stability after the First World War. But we found that the League of Nations had failed. And one of the lessons that they learned from that was that you needed a certain dominant power structure which would be able to exercise its will, so to say. And some of it was embodied in what is known as the veto. In some instances, many of those that you cited just now, and we've seen many of them in recent times, particularly in conflict situations where big powers are often involved or they are involved in a proxy capacity, we find that there is a tendency to use the veto, which actually prevents UN peacekeeping, peace-building kind of operations. I think that has been a big stumbling block in many of these bigger conflict situations. The other thing is about, and I think Dr. Sharma mentioned very correctly about representation. What we do find is that the African continent has not really been able to evolve a consensus which can be taken to the United Nations for a viable option as to how the UN Security Council can be represented. Is it two? Who are these two? So Africa, in a sense, has to make up its mind and decide who those two will be, if it is for two members from the UN, from the African continent. The other thing that you mentioned very importantly is in the nature of work that it does. In peacekeeping, the idea has evolved significantly from the earlier operations. You remember that in Youth Hunt's time, we found that there were many peacekeeping operations, whether it was in Congo or, there were these Korea operations, and many of those were actually quite successful. And the idea that the reason why it was successful was because they were able to get a very clear mandate as to what the role of the UN peacekeeping operations would be. Today, in a very much more complex situation where decolonization has been resolved to a large extent in large parts of the world, but there are still old conflicts that remain, we need a broader ambit of peacekeeping operations. For instance, peace building is one of these aspects that needs to be done, which has to happen at a stage before. In some ways, the involvement of civilian security forces tries to do this under the UN umbrella. But I think what we also need is peacekeeping, peace maintenance, which has to be done, and the kind of respect that it has in the rules of engagement. So this is something that India in particular has been very active in trying to bring about these norms that we try and bring about. The related aspect of this, which is not always related to sovereign states, but something that the UN has to take up much more seriously, is the widespread prevalence of terrorism, which has happened, which are often, in a sense, state-sponsored. And then we do have a committee, that is the Sanctions Committee, which looks at the proscribing of terrorist elements and terrorist groups. But again, we found that various political interests and various alliance structures come into play over here. And so we are not able to take very effective measures against terrorism, which again is a major security threat, though it is not really a state-to-state activity. So the UN needs to reinvent itself in some ways. And also, as Dr. Sharma said, it needs to have broader representation of the aspirations of the world as it is today, not what it was in 1945.
You're right. So the United Nations, all in all, Professor, has fallen short of not just underrepresentation or lack of representation of across continents of populations. For example, India now being the world's most populated country, and there are several others as well, as we've spoken about. It has also fallen short of addressing concerns like terrorism, which India has been highlighting on the global platforms for several years. Also on issues of development priorities. So clearly there is a huge vacuum which perhaps several other multilateral institutions have begun to fill in. But taking on from what Ambassador said about how there are differences in economic or security priorities of each of the continents. So for example, Africa, Latin America, Asia, there are also divergences on development priorities. India has, taken the initiative to become the voice of the global South. There have been multiple initiatives that we've taken in recent years to represent the global South at the global platforms. But do you think it's too ambitious a vision to overcome all of these divergences that these populations and these continents have? And if yes, how can India, at least reduce those divergences and truly work towards that collective push for reform that Dr. Jaishankar has been speaking about?
One thing very interesting about UN is that over the number of years, the last 8 decades of its journey up until now, it has been involved in almost every aspect of the global order. Say, for example, the mandate of peace, prosperity, reduction of poverty, dealing with crisis, disaster management, whatever you name, and it is out there, dealing with communities, capacity buildings. And this is inherent in the structure of the United Nations, as it was there to address all these important aspects of life. Now, if we look at the performance for past 8 decades, it has been happening smoothly in the non-conflict areas or the domains in which it has been continuously working, such as upliftment of communities, equality, gender, human rights, and all other things. Whenever there is a situation of conflict and where the United Nations becomes ineffective in terms of either because of the proxy presence, as Ambassador Sir was saying, proxy presence of the United Nations Security Council permanent members or the non-permanent members or any other factor which guides the functioning of the or influences the functioning of the UN, then it becomes a matter of concern and we suddenly start asking the relevance of the is UN effective enough or is UN kind of a body which will continue to exercise its influence or all these things. But at the same time, we also need to look at the contribution the United Nations has made in terms of poverty reduction and developmental initiatives all across the world, which exist in the form of specialized agencies which have been involved at the grassroots level in almost all the countries, along with peacekeeping, development and empowerment. Now, if we have to monetarily translate all that work which has been done by the United Nations so far, it would run into trillions of dollars, as compared to the amount of the funding that goes into UN. Now, what is very important and one form of reform which is very urgent and necessary for UN to effectively function in the other areas also is one is the funding. And the second aspect I would bring about is the expertise in the United Nations. Some of the organizations like Trusteeship Council, they are defunct now. They are no longer functional. They are either to be closed or they need to be merged with other organizations in order to do away with the kind of burden of the bureaucratic procedures and all other things which are becoming a kind of a small burden or a liability upon the UN. But at the same time, UN needs to address some of the pressing challenges which are just not the traditional security threats which are related to military or armed conflicts, but also the non-traditional security threats, such as energy security, food security, human rights, human security. So these are some of the areas where there is actually a need for a body such as UN or a multilateral organization to venture into or to address these issues because they are going to have real-time impact. Now, what role India has to play in this? Apart from the UN being a multilateral body at a very large scale, India is part of many of the regional organizations or the smaller scale multilateral bodies, one such being G20. And this is where India was successful in making African Union as part of G20, which then further represents. So it's not just the representation in terms of number, but it is a qualitative, significant representation in terms of bringing the like-minded partners together on this platform. Now, your question of diversity, how do you address this diversity? It is not a bottom-up approach, because some of the concerns such as terrorism, energy security, food security, climate change, and all these things are global concerns which certainly need certain local solutions. So when we are discussing all these global problems at a common platform, it is very convenient for the developing world to learn from the experiences of the developed countries, and at the same time have or to borrow from the capacities or expertise from these countries. Now, this is where India has an important role to play, because we tend to bridge the gap between the developed and the developing countries. And the capacities that India has, the ability to communicate, to offer a leadership role, this is something where we can bridge this gap, overcome the diversity, the differences between the two worlds of the developing or underdeveloped, I would say, and then provide a kind of global, a voice to the global south to come on the global high table and express itself more clearly.
Certainly, India has been making consistent efforts. India has been making consistent efforts in that regard. We've seen initiatives when G20 was chaired by India. But Professor, you spoke about some of the contemporary threats that we are witnessing. My next question, in fact, was about some of the emerging threats that the world has already begun to witness, but which will escalate in the times to come. There are threats like cyber warfare. There is AI-enabled disinformation. There is climate migration that is looming. The question is the United Nations, which everyone will look towards, is it even structurally equipped to respond? Forget the contemporary realities. There are multilateral groupings that each of the countries are looking towards, and that's something that Dr. Jaishankar also highlighted, that the global south is looking towards these multilateral institutions, but unfortunately they're also not equipped in that manner. What about the United Nations, formed in 1945, has not evolved, is not taking the contemporary realities into account? What about the futuristic challenges?
Tina, the world has really changed since then, although of course conflict remains, but it is now concentrated in certain regions, and even if it tries to move out of the country, but at least it would not escalate to the level of the Second World War. Point number two, the contemporary realities and the threats in the future. As I just mentioned about the non-traditional security threats, there is a need for the UN first to have proper resources in order to address these challenges. Number two, have expertise in order to spread the idea. One problem which we always face with United Nations is that it is a non-binding nature of the resolutions. Now, it is very easy for the big and the powerful countries to walk out of these resolutions or do not pay a heed, but at least it gives a moral direction. And in some of the resolutions, the discussions do not take up to or extend up to the level of the implementation of these resolutions. But for the developing countries or the lesser developed countries, some of these pressing concerns actually need some amount of hand-holding, funding in terms of resources, funding in terms of financing these transition, what we talk about, say, for example, green transition, having greener technologies. So in that case, the United Nations really need to restructure itself in order to, say, for example, develop expertise in ocean health, or you can say cybersecurity in the coming future. And this is where some specialized agencies or bodies have to come up which address these issues, which are no longer just local in nature, but gradually become more and more pressing at the global level.
But then the bottom line comes to, it's a circle. We are talking about what ought to have, but then the bottom line is that until the P5 wants the reforms to happen, it won't happen. All of us know they will never allow countries like India, countries like Japan or Germany to come on the same table as they have and discuss these issues that pertain to the or they perhaps they go against these bigger countries as well. One question, Ambassador, that I want to ask you is, and this is from the answer that you gave in the beginning, that the geopolitical scenario in 2025 is quite similar to 1945 when the United Nations actually came into being. So if the United Nations were being founded, say, in 2025, what, according to you, would it look like structurally? Which would be the countries that would actually be bringing the contemporary realities, taking into account the development priorities of the countries that have for so long been overlooked?
I would say that the 1945 and 2025 scenarios bear certain similarities in terms of the fact that conflict is becoming widespread and that development aspirations are not being met. I would just wish to kind of go back a little bit before I come to the point that you raised, that, I think the United Nations has tried to address the changing situation. So the kind of debate and discussion that we have on climate change, for instance, on the issue of migration, for instance, are issues that are very central to the United Nations today. The new issue that the UN is trying to grapple with, and it has established mechanisms, is on how it deals with the digital world and digital governance and all the issues related to the big transformation, the disruptive transformation coming about because of our advent into the digital era, is something that the UN is looking at much more closely today. And there is a big chapter on digital governance, which, unlike many other activities in the UN, which are led and participated primarily by states, that is by governments, this particular one has the participation not only of the
To watch more programs of Sansad TV, subscribe to our YouTube channel and don't forget to like and share them.